There is a hole at the centre of the debate about civilizations. The dominant civilization of the last 2 centuries rarely uses the expression Western civilization. There is instead repeated reference to the West, a recognition that the countries that are seen as Western share an important economic, political, and cultural legacy, combined with various contemporary values, norms, and political systems. Similarly, in Western discourse, the idea of different civilizations in the present, rather than in the distant past, is largely absent. One of the most important exceptions to this is Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations. The West views the world overwhelmingly in terms of nation states, confining the notion of civilization to history. For the West, the nation state is usually dated from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, but the latter was, until the 20th century, a more or less exclusively European phenomenon, apart from its various offshoots, such as the US and Australia. The global spread of European colonialism from the end of the 15th century, but especially the 18th century, meant that most of the world was incorporated into the colonial empires of Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, and others. With no independent existence, denied and deprived of much of their pre-existing history and culture, it was not until the mid-20th century they acquired self-rule and became independent nation states. The exceptions were Britain's white settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, which in the case of the first three, for essentially racial and cultural reasons, became independent much earlier. This history helps us to understand why the concept and the term civilization only has a shadowy existence in Western discourse. Civilization speaks to a history and a culture that is independent of the West and predates Western dominance, be they African, Muslim, or Hindu civilizational traditions, amongst countless others. But we now live in an entirely different era. The most important single event of the last century was national liberation and the overthrow of colonial rule. It enabled for the first time in the modern era the majority of people in the world to rule their own countries, become subjects in their own rights, and not appendages of their colonial rulers. But independence, except in the most formal sense, did not mean and has not meant respect or equality. The hierarchies of the past lived on in the culture and mentality of people in both the colonizer and the colonized states, in what might be described as an implicit global hierarchy of race, with whites at the top and those of African descent generally near or at the bottom. Whites still enjoy far greater power and influence than any other race. But this hierarchy is under growing challenge. It is one of the great themes of this century. The rise of China confounds and disrupts this Western mental picture. The underlying assumption that a white Western tradition was, is, and will continue to be superior to all others. We should not underestimate just how deep these attitudes remain in predominantly white societies. After 4 decades of China's rise, there is still little understanding of in the West of how and why it has been possible. Knowledge of China remains skin deep. This helps to explain why Western attitudes towards China could go into such rapid retreat after 2016 and Trump's assault on China. The denigration of China has had a simplistic template bordering on the inane. It reduces Chinese history more or less solely to the period since 1949. Everything before 1949 is ignored, as if China only started in that year, The reason such nonsense has credibility in the West is because of the mountain of ignorance about China, its history and its culture. The object has been to equate China with communism and the Soviet Communist Party, revive the prejudices of the Cold War, and deploy racist tropes like the China virus and the idea that China only rose because it cheated and stole from the West. You cannot understand China unless you understand Chinese civilization. China is a product of and is shaped by its civilizational history. The West is besieged by the challenge of profoundly different civilizations. The rise of China is the most obvious and important, but is not the only one. European colonization involved the subjugation of a majority of the world's population. In the US and Australia, it resulted in the virtual elimination of the native peoples. To a lesser extent, this was also the case in Canada and New Zealand. As a result of European expansion, the West is now confronted with two great problems, one global, the other domestic. First, there is the rise of the developing world, the countries and peoples that the West subjugated, and the accompanying decline of the West. The reordering of the global hierarchy that this involves will be profound, multidimensional, protracted, and for the West, very painful. It is already well underway. It is not an accident that the far right in numerous Western countries believes that white supremacy is under threat. In reality, white people constitute only about 10% of the world's population. The rise of the developing world represents a huge civilizational challenge to the West. The domestic challenge is because Western expansion led to huge migration, both forced and voluntary, that transformed their populations. That is why both the UK and France, which possessed Europe's two largest empires, have such racially diverse populations. 13% of the UK's population, for example, is non-white. The traditions and cultures of the latter are different, a combination of where they came from, Indian, Caribbean, African, and many others, and their new British identity. The greatest single challenge of recent times is, as in France, posed by Muslims. The British have been obliged in the face of its new citizens to rethink many of their assumptions and ideas of who they are. But this is a long and painful process, and discrimination by the dominant whites against non-white minorities, most notably Muslims, remains deep and systemic. The recent terrorist attacks in France in connection with the cartoons in Charlie Hebdo ridiculing the Prophet Muhammad are an outrage. But the French government's response, insisting that free speech without constraint is an inalienable French right, regardless of the sensibilities and belief systems of others, is unsustainable in a multiracial and multicultural society. It is a hangover from when France was an exclusively white society and an imperial power. This brings me to the United States. The United States has never come to terms with the legacy of slavery. Millions of Africans were forcibly shipped to the US and made to work on the plantations as slaves. Although slavery was formally abolished in 1865, an apartheid system which largely denied African Americans their rights, including the right to vote, rapidly replaced it. It was not until the 1960s and the civil rights movement that this changed. But as we see in the widespread arbitrary murder of blacks by an overwhelmingly white police force, African Americans are still treated as second-class citizens. At the heart of America is a deep civilizational question, respect for difference, which it has singularly failed to come to terms with. Thank you.